What would you do if your family handed you a wooden crate of water-damaged canvases, then laughed all the way back to their SUVs? The afternoon light was the particular shade of grey that Toronto reserves for late November, thin and cold, the kind that drains colour from everything it touches. The offices of Baxter and Finch, barristers and solicitors, occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Bay Street, and the boardroom smelled of recycled air, expensive cologne, and something Margaret Okafor, 56, had come to recognize over 6 long years, the particular quiet of people waiting to collect. She sat with her back straight in a leather chair that cost more than her monthly grocery bill, her hands folded in her lap. Her wool coat was from Winners, slightly pilled at the elbows, and she hadn't bothered to take it off because the room felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Her brother, Derek Okafor, 61, sat to her left in a charcoal suit, checking his phone with the expression of a man who has somewhere better to be. His wife, Pauline, sat beside him, her fingers resting on a Louis Vuitton tote, her gaze drifting around the room with the practiced boredom of someone performing disinterest. Their cousin Bryce slouched near the window, arms crossed, already wearing the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head. They were all there for the reading of the will of Samuel Okafor, who had died 2 weeks earlier at the age of 83, in the small bedroom of his house on Greenwood Avenue, with Margaret holding his hand. Samuel had been a remarkable man. He had come to Canada from Lagos in 1971 with a suitcase, a degree in engineering, and a stubbornness his children had inherited in varying measures. He had built a modest but solid life in Scarborough, raised his 2 children after his wife passed, and spent his retirement quietly, painting in his garage with the obsessive focus of someone who had discovered art too late and resented every wasted year before it. In his last 4 years, the Parkinsons had taken the brush from his hand long before it took anything else. In his final 2, dementia had moved in like an unwelcome tenant, rearranging everything familiar until Samuel could no longer find his own name in a room. Margaret, who had worked for 22 years as a high school art teacher in the Peel District School Board, had requested early retirement at 50 to come home. She had converted the dining room into a space where Samuel could sit and watch the light change on the back garden. She had learned which music still reached him when words no longer could. She had managed his medications, his appointments, his dignity. She had done it without complaint, in the way that people do things when they simply cannot imagine doing otherwise. Derek, meanwhile, had relocated his financial planning practice to Calgary in 2019. He called at Christmas and on Samuel's birthday, and he had visited twice in 4 years, both times for fewer than 48 hours, both times with the strained cheerfulness of a man checking a box. Pauline had not come at all after the second visit, citing variously her yoga schedule, a fear of flying during COVID, and what she described as a sensitive constitution that made hospitals and care environments difficult for her. Bryce, who lived 20 minutes away in Leslieville, had stopped answering Margaret's calls entirely by the 3rd year. Martin Finch, the family solicitor, was a compact man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the measured manner of someone who has delivered difficult news so many times that difficult had ceased to have texture. He opened the folder in front of him, cleared his throat once, and began. The house on Greenwood Avenue went to Derek. The investment portfolio, modest but real, built over 50 years of careful frugality, went to Derek. The RSP residual, after tax, went to Derek. A small cash bequest of $8,000 went to Bryce. Samuel's tools went to a neighbor named Roy. His car, a 2009 Civic with 187,000 kilometers on it, went to a young man from their old church. Margaret sat very still. Martin Finch turned the final page. To my daughter Margaret, he read, in recognition of her years of devoted presence, I leave the contents of the wooden storage crate in the detached garage. Specifically, the flat crate with the blue tarp and everything inside it. Derek made a sound, a short, compressed exhalation through the nose. He pressed his lips together. He did not look at Margaret. Pauline, however, did. Her expression carried the particular calibration of someone suppressing a smile. "The garage," Bryce said to no one in particular. "Is that the stuff from his painting phase?" "I believe so," said Martin Finch, who had the decency to look at the table. Martin reached beneath the credenza and lifted a key on a plain metal ring, setting it on the table in front of Margaret. "The garage padlock," he said quietly. "I was given this by your father 3 weeks before he passed. He left no additional instructions." Margaret picked up the key. The metal was cold and unremarkable in her palm. "Dad always did have a flair for the dramatic," Derek said, buttoning his jacket as he rose. He said it pleasantly, the way people say things they mean to wound while leaving themselves room to deny it. "I'll have the property transfer paperwork sent to you by end of week, Finch." He did not say goodbye to Margaret. He simply left Pauline a half step behind him, the quiet click of the boardroom door the only punctuation. The drive back to Scarborough took 40 minutes in the grey traffic. Margaret parked in her father's driveway. Derek's driveway now, she corrected herself, and sat in the car for a moment before going around to the detached garage at the back of the property. The space smelled of motor oil and dried paint thinner and something else, something underneath those things, warm and particular. The smell of her father's work shirts, of sawdust and turpentine, and the particular industrial cleaner he used to wipe his palette. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in before she let herself move toward the back wall. The crate was there, as Martin Finch had described. It was flat and wide, roughly the size of a door, made from rough pine that had gone grey with age. A blue plastic tarp had been folded over it and bungee corded down. The whole thing sat against the back wall, partially blocked by a broken folding chair and a rusted bike pump. Margaret pulled the tarp aside. The wood was damaged. One corner had soft rot from what looked like a years-old roof leak. The fibers gone spongy and dark. The crate smelled of mildew. Stenciled in black on the side, in the blocky print her father had used for labeling everything, were the letters SFO Originals. Handle carefully. Below that, someone had written in pencil, at a different time, in different handwriting. Not worth anything to anyone but me. She stared at that line for a long moment. She found a dolly in the corner. It took her 40 minutes, working alone, to load the crate into the back of her Honda CR-V. By the time she secured it, the November dark had come down completely, and her shoulder ached from an old rotator cuff injury she'd aggravated, lifting her father's wheelchair in and out of cars for 2 years. Her phone rang as she was locking the garage. Derek. She almost didn't answer. Something made her. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice smooth in the way it always was when he was managing her, "about the crate." "What about it?" "I just think you should know. I'm the one who suggested it to Dad, actually. A few months back, when he still had his lucid periods. We were talking about what to leave you, and I pointed out you were always the artsy one. I thought his old painting supplies would mean something to you. Sentimentally." A pause. "I hope you're not expecting much else, Maggie." He was very clear with me about his wishes. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. "You suggested it." I was trying to be thoughtful. His tone was careful now, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ice. Dad agreed it was appropriate. He even laughed about it, said it was very fitting. She hung up. She sat in the dark car for a long time, hands in her lap, looking at the back of the house where she had spent 6 years. The upstairs window of the room that had been her father's, the one she'd sat beside on the worst nights, was dark. She thought about the will. She thought about appropriate. She thought about Derek's laugh on the other end of the line. Her bank account held $412. She had not had a full-time salary in 6 years. Her own RRSPs had been depleted to cover expenses when her father's pension check hadn't stretched far enough some months. Her credit card had a balance she tried not to look at directly. She thought, sitting in the dark, the crate is large. There could be many canvases inside. Her father had painted obsessively for almost 15 years before the Parkinsons ended it. Maybe there was something someone would want to buy. A gallery sale. Even a few $100s would give her room to breathe, while she figured out what came next. It was not hope exactly, it was mathematics. Back at her own apartment in East York, a one-bedroom she'd kept on a reduced sublease while she was at her father's, she made tea and opened her laptop. She looked up auction houses, estate sale companies, art dealers. She thought about who her father had admired, who he'd studied, what movements had shaped his practice. Samuel Okafor had been largely self-taught, but he had been serious about it in the way self-taught people sometimes are, with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. He had read everything he could find about the Group of Seven, about the Automatistes, about Lauren Harris and Emily Carr. He had corresponded, years ago, with a dealer in Montreal who specialized in mid-century Canadian work. In the morning, she drove to the distillery district. The Callaway Gallery occupied a long, brick-walled space in one of the converted Victorian industrial buildings. It was the kind of place that had exposed beams and strategic lighting and canvases that cost more than sedans. Margaret had been inside twice in her life, both times as a teacher bringing students. She knew the owner by reputation, Frederick Callaway, 64, who was said to have an eye like a scalpel and a tongue to match. She parked illegally on a side street and brought one canvas inside, wrapped in a bedsheet. She had opened the crate the night before, working carefully in the kitchen light. There were 11 paintings total, on wooden stretchers, ranging from small to quite large. Several had suffered from the damp, blooming along the edges, the wood bowing slightly, but the paint itself, wherever she could see it clearly, was dense and layered, applied in a way that was confident and strange, unlike anything she remembered her father producing in the garage. That had confused her. She didn't recognize his hand in them. She unwrapped the canvas in the gallery entrance. Frederick Callaway appeared from the back, took one look at her coat, one look at the bedsheet, and assumed an expression of courteous finality. "We're by appointment for consignments," he said. "I'm not consigning anything," Margaret said. "I just need 30 seconds of your time. I'm trying to understand what I'm looking at." Frederick's gaze moved to the canvas, which she was now holding up against the brick wall. He crossed his arms, clearly preparing to send her away with some brief, not unkind language that would end the conversation. He didn't. He went very still. His arms uncrossed slowly, the way a person's arms uncross when they've forgotten they were crossed. He tilted his head 3 degrees to the left. His expression did something complicated, not quite recognition, not quite disbelief, but something between them, something that required all of his face to process. He walked forward, stopped 2 feet from the canvas, put on his glasses, and leaned in. The painting was dark at first assessment, browns and deep greens, the suggestion of water, of shield rock, of sky pressed low over a boreal landscape. But within that darkness, there was a quality of light that was nearly physical, as though the canvas were lit from behind by something the paint had trapped and was slowly releasing. The brushwork was dense and impasto, applied in rhythmic, almost sculptural strokes, and there was something in the composition, the way the horizon broke, the way the tree line held its weight, that was at once utterly familiar and impossible. "Where did you get this?" Frederick said. His voice had dropped to something close to a murmur. "My father's estate. He had 11 of them in a crate in his garage." "Your father." "Samuel Okafor. He passed 2 weeks ago." Frederick straightened. He looked at her. He looked back at the painting. He took his glasses off, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on, looked again. "I need you to bring the others." Margaret brought the others. Frederick locked the front door, flipped his sign to closed, and spent 45 minutes going through each canvas in near silence, handling them with latex gloves, holding them at angles to the light, photographing certain details with his phone. Margaret sat on a bench near the window and watched a man who, until an hour ago, had barely registered her as worth speaking to, move through her father's paintings like someone in the presence of something that frightened him. Finally, he stopped. He stood in the center of the gallery floor, surrounded by 11 canvases leaning against every available surface, and pressed both hands flat against his face for a moment, the way people do when they need to keep something in. "Miss Okafor," he said, his hands coming down. His eyes, she saw, were wet. "Do you know the name Cedric Beaumont?" She didn't. Frederick went to his desk and returned with a hardcover catalogue, the kind museums produce for major retrospectives. He opened it and handed it to her. The page showed a large, dark painting, shield rock, boreal tree line, sky pressed low over dark water, that looked, in composition and technique and quality of light, nearly identical to what was currently leaning against his gallery wall. "Cedric Beaumont," Frederick said, his voice tight with the effort of steadiness, "was a Quebecois painter who worked from approximately 1938 to 1971, based first in Bay St. Paul and then in Algonquin Park. He was, in the opinion of several serious scholars, the most significant Canadian landscape painter of his generation. He was also, during his lifetime, almost completely unknown, because he was pathologically reclusive and refused to exhibit or sell his work. When he died in 1972, his studio burned in what was ruled an accidental fire, and with it, most of his catalogue. The art world knows of approximately 23 surviving works. Most are in museum collections. The Musée National des Beaux-Arts du Québec has 6. The AGO has 2. Margaret looked at the catalogue, then at the canvases leaning against the walls of the gallery. "These are not in the catalogue," Frederick continued, in the tone of someone announcing something he hadn't yet fully allowed himself to believe. "Which means they're from before the fire, or from years the scholarly record doesn't account for, or both. Every major Canadian art institution has an outstanding inquiry for undocumented Beaumont works. The Montreal Museum offered a standing reward for information on their whereabouts in 2019. The AGO's Acquisitions Committee has had a fund earmarked for a Beaumont purchase for 11 years. My father had these," Margaret said carefully, "in a crate in a garage in Scarborough." "Your father's family, was there a Quebec connection?" Margaret thought. Her grandmother on Samuel's side, Esther, had grown up in the Laurentians. Samuel had spoken of her only occasionally, and the memories were fragmentary. But there had been a story years ago at the dinner table about Esther's first marriage before she'd come to Nigeria, a brief, unhappy union to a man from Bay St. Paul. The story had been told as a footnote, unimportant, a piece of family history that connected to nothing else. "I think there may be," Margaret said slowly. "I think my grandmother may have known him, known Beaumont." Frederick sat down suddenly, as though his legs had decided the conversation warranted it. He put his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor, and Margaret saw his hands were shaking slightly, not from age but from the specific tremor of a person standing next to something enormous. "Miss Okafor," he said, looking up, his voice rough now, stripped of the lacquer it had carried an hour ago. "What your father left you, the 11 canvases alone, given their provenance and condition, we would be looking at an estimated auction value, conservatively, of between $4 and $7 million. Some individual canvases could exceed $2 million apiece. There are institutions that would pay a premium to acquire the collection intact. The National Gallery has a Beaumont Acquisition Committee that has been waiting for this exact phone call for a decade." Margaret did not speak. "Are you all right?" Frederick asked. "No," Margaret said, which was honest. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table with the garage key still in her pocket and a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, and she let herself feel, for a few minutes, every single thing that was pressing against the inside of her chest. The exhaustion of 6 years, the particular grief of watching someone brilliant and difficult become someone unreachable. The humiliation of the boardroom, Derek's voice on the phone, saying appropriate, the $412 in her account, the rotator cuff ache that never fully went away. She let herself feel all of it, and then she called a lawyer. Her friend Carolyn. They'd taught together at the same school for 12 years, had a nephew who practiced estate litigation in a firm on King Street West. His name was Jonathan Fry, 38, and he came highly recommended by people who had reason to know. Margaret called him that evening. By the following morning, she had retained him. She also found something in the crate she hadn't noticed the first time through, tucked flat against the inside of the lid in a manila envelope, sealed with tape that had dried and yellowed. A letter in her father's handwriting, dated 14 months before his death, from one of the last stretches when his mind had been clear. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then the crate is in your possession, which means everything has gone the way I hoped it would. I want you to know that I was not confused when I made these arrangements. I had a good week in September, the best in a long time, and I used it to call Martin Finch and to write this letter and to be very sure of what I was doing. I know what Derek thinks of you. I know what he says to Pauline about you, because Bryce told me once, not meaning to. I know he will try to shape this process to suit himself, and I know that I cannot stop him from inheriting what the law says he inherits. But the law does not know what is in that crate, and neither does Derek, and I have taken care to keep it that way. Your grandmother Esther kept those paintings for 50 years without telling anyone what they were. She gave them to me the year before she died and told me to keep them safe and give them to the one person in the family she trusted to understand what they were worth. Not the money, she said, the paintings, the worth of the paintings themselves. She told me your name specifically, Margaret. She said you would know what to do. I believe she was right. You have always seen things clearly, even when seeing them clearly was harder than looking away. The man who painted these was someone your grandmother loved when she was young, before she came to Nigeria, before everything else. She never spoke of it. She kept the paintings because they were the only honest record she had of that time. I think she would be glad they are going to someone who will treat them with the same care she did. Take the money, my darling, when it comes. Take all of it and do not apologize for a single cent. I love you. Dad. The news moved the way news moves in the art world, carefully at first, then all at once. Jonathan filed the necessary documentation, and Frederick made a series of discreet calls that resulted in a preliminary authentication visit from a team at the AGO within the week. The authentication process, Jonathan explained, but the preliminary opinion of the AGO's senior curator, Dr. Amara Johal, who had studied Beaumont's technique for 2 decades, was delivered in the measured language of academic caution that barely contained what was underneath it, complete and absolute certainty. By the 3rd week, Margaret had relocated the canvases to a climate-controlled storage facility the gallery arranged, and she had moved herself into a hotel downtown. Not expensive, but clean and warm, paid by an advance from a Montreal auction house that had contacted Jonathan with a preemptive offer before the authentication was even complete. Derek arrived on a Friday morning. She heard the knock and opened the door, and there he was, in another charcoal suit, his face the color of old chalk. Pauline was behind him, her hands clenched around the strap of her bag. Behind them both was a man Margaret didn't recognize, the lawyer Derek had brought. "We need to talk," Derek said, and walked in without being invited, the same way people do when they've decided that manners are a luxury for situations where they have the upper hand. "You stole," he said, the word rough, like he'd been holding it in the car. "Those paintings belonged to the estate. To the full estate, not to some specific bequest. They were listed in the will," Margaret said. She had known this moment was coming and had spent 3 evenings with Jonathan preparing for it. She was calm in a way she hadn't been in a very long time. The calm of a person who has finally stopped waiting for something and started doing it instead. Specifically listed, the crate and everything inside it. Dad didn't know what was inside it. He had dementia. The listing is meaningless. He couldn't have understood the value of what he was bequeathing. He wasn't in a period of dementia when he wrote his instructions, Margaret said. He was assessed as cognitively competent by his GP in September of last year. Martin Finch has the paperwork. Jonathan has the paperwork. You can have copies. Derek's composure slipped one visible degree. His jaw tightened. We're contesting, Pauline said from behind him, her voice high and thin. We have grounds. You manipulated him. Pauline, Margaret said, looking at her sister-in-law with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. I spent 6 years managing his medications, driving him to appointments, sleeping in a chair outside his door on the nights he was frightened. I gave up my pension contributions, my savings, my career. I did not do it for the paintings. I didn't know about the paintings, but I'm the one he trusted with them, and I think we both know why. Derek's lawyer stepped forward and began talking. Margaret let him finish. When he was done, she opened the door to the adjoining room, and Jonathan came through. Jonathan Fry was not an imposing man physically, but he had the particular quality of someone who never says anything he hasn't already won. He set a folder on the coffee table. Mr. Okafor, he said pleasantly, before your client pursues litigation, I'd suggest he spend some time with the current status of the estate he inherited. He opened the folder. The Greenwood Avenue property has a third mortgage that your father took out in 2021, the proceeds of which funded a failed real estate investment in Barry that is currently in receivership. The investment portfolio has a margin call outstanding that your client was notified of by email 4 months ago and chose not to address. The current net equity of the Greenwood Avenue property, after the outstanding mortgages are subtracted, is approximately negative $60,000. That means your client has not inherited a house. He has inherited a debt obligation. The color went out of Derek's face in stages like a painting left too long in the sun. That's, he started. Documented, Jonathan said, by the estate's own financial records, which your client received in the will package from Martin Finch. If he had read the full disclosure, he would have known this before the reading. I'm told he did not request the financial schedules. Because Margaret understood, Derek had been so certain he was collecting, so sure of the picture he'd always carried of himself as the capable one, the son who'd made something of his life while his sister wasted hers in Scarborough changing bedpans, that he'd never thought to look past the headings. He'd seen the words house, portfolio, investments, and he'd stopped reading. He'd seen the surface and assumed it told the whole story. Just as he'd looked at a wooden crate with a blue top and seen garbage. Your client, Jonathan continued, is welcome to initiate a challenge to the estate's specific bequest to my client. I would estimate the litigation timeline at 2 to 3 years, at a cost that, given the parties' relative financial positions, would be asymmetric in my client's favor. Alternatively, your client can direct his energy to the receivership proceeding in Barry, which has a response deadline of the 14th. He closed the folder. I'd recommend the latter. Derek's own lawyer was quiet. Derek stood in the middle of the hotel room for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, looking the way people look when the story they've been telling themselves for years has been revised without their consent, and they haven't caught up yet. Then he straightened his jacket. He walked to the door. He didn't look at Margaret as he passed her. At the door, he stopped. He didn't turn around. She told me to give you that crate, he said very quietly. Dad did. He told me she'd asked him to make sure you got it. I thought he was confused. He left. The door closed. Margaret stood at the window and looked out at the city. The lake was somewhere beyond the skyline, invisible but present the way things are when you know they're there. She thought about her father in the garage, in the years before the Parkinsons, standing in front of a canvas with his reading glasses on, studying technique in a way that had always seemed slightly desperate to her. The intensity of a man trying to compress a lifetime of looking into a much shorter window than he'd expected. She thought about her grandmother, Esther, who had carried 11 paintings from Quebec to Nigeria to Canada and kept them in a crate for 50 years, and said nothing to anyone except Samuel, and only then at the end. She thought about what it means to recognize the value in something that everyone else has looked at and looked away from. To carry a thing that is heavy and unglamorous, and offers nothing to look at from the outside, and to carry it anyway, because you have decided it matters. The authentication was completed 4 months later. All 11 canvases were confirmed as works by Cedric Beaumont, 8 of them previously unknown to the scholarly record. The collection was acquired by a consortium of the National Gallery of Canada and the Musée National des Beaux-Arts du Québec in a joint purchase. The largest acquisition of Canadian art in either institution's recent history, at a total value that Jonathan called Margaret about on a Tuesday afternoon in March, while she was sitting in a coffee shop on Danforth, and that made the person at the next table look over when she pressed her hand over her mouth. She kept one painting, a small one unfinished, that Frederick believed was Beaumont working on a study he'd abandoned, just the beginning of a tree line, 3 or 4 strokes of that strange trapped light, and then nothing else. She had it framed and hung it in the apartment she rented, a proper one this time, with a second bedroom and a window that faced west. Her father's letter she kept in a drawer by her bed, in an envelope with his handwriting on it, and some evenings she took it out and read it again. Not because she had forgotten what it said, but because certain things need to be read more than once before they become fully real. If you've ever been the one who stayed, who showed up when it was inconvenient, who carried the heavy thing everyone else refused to touch, then you already understand what this story is really about. It was never about the paintings. It was about what gets passed on to the person willing to bear the weight of it. If that hits somewhere close to home, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories about inheritance, hidden worth, and the families we navigate to find ourselves, subscribe to Claim the Drama. We'll be here.